Her words landed like a cold blade. "Sir, I need you to step aside right now. Dallas Airport was packed that afternoon, but Jacob Warren's entire world shrank to the space between him and the check-in counter, where gate agent Megan Holt stood, her eyes scanning him as if he had just tried to walk through a door that wasn't meant for him. Jacob, 42 years old, CEO of Skyark Airlines, but traveling incognito in a simple navy suit, tightened his grip on his black leather briefcase and held out his boarding pass seat, 1A first class. Yet even with the words printed clearly on the paper, Megan stared at him with suspicion, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she were preparing to deliver a verdict. "You may be at the wrong gate," she said, her tone duller than the fluorescent lights above. Jacob felt the air shift. The stairs around him began to land like tiny needles, slow and cold, each glance asking an unspoken question. Was he really holding a first-class ticket? In the distance, the rolling sound of suitcase wheels echoed like a reminder of a story he had lived far too many times. Pressure simmered in his chest, but he kept his voice soft as breath. "I am at the correct gate. My ticket is seat 1A. Megan didn't touch the ticket. She only tilted her head, annoyed, and walked toward the intercom phone. She didn't need to raise her voice. The small, petty authority radiating from her was more than enough to thicken the air. Jacob stood still, but inside him, thunder rolled. Across the terminal, passengers whispered. A salt-and-pepper-haired man leaned toward his wife, murmuring something. A woman with an expensive designer bag gave Jacob a slow once-over, as if measuring whether he deserved to stand where he was standing. Jacob inhaled deeply. Again. Not the first time, not something unfamiliar. Yet every time struck the same place in his chest, the same dull ache, the same feeling of being treated as an outsider, inside the very space he had helped build for millions of travelers every year. Megan returned with her supervisor, Brian Keller, a man whose posture suggested he believed he was always right. "There's an issue with the seating," Brian said quickly, his tone flat. "We need to re-verify seat 1A. Jacob raised his ticket again, his expression calm, though a storm churned beneath it. "That seat was confirmed by your internal system. There is no conflict." But Brian wasn't listening, or rather, he had no intention of listening. "Sir, please step over here and wait. We need to continue boarding." His voice was a little louder this time, just enough to make surrounding passengers turn their heads. A familiar tactic using public pressure, stirring embarrassment, pushing the target toward compliance. Jacob stepped aside near the wall, standing straight, silent. He didn't want a scene. Not now. But his quietness only fed their curiosity. Then came the moment that made his heart drop. Edward Briggs, a wealthy investor, and someone Skyark had bent over backward for in many past deals, approached the counter. Megan instantly brightened, her smile blooming like a flower. She scanned his ticket with syrupy sweetness. "Welcome, Mr. Briggs. Seat 1A is ready for you." Jacob looked at her. She didn't look back. Brian returned with a freshly printed list. "Mr. Warren," he said, using Jacob's name for the first time, but with the cold tone of someone issuing a penalty, "you've been reassigned to seat 32E. You may file a complaint after the flight." The air seemed to shatter into sharp glass, thin pieces. "Unacceptable," Jacob said, his voice low-cold and deep enough to make Brian finally glance at him. "My ticket is for seat 1A. Brian crossed his arms, wielding his small authority like a gavel. "So we're asking for your cooperation. Don't delay the flight." The word cooperation dropped like an invisible shackle. People around them lifted their phones. Someone started recording. Someone chuckled under their breath. Someone whispered. A black man being doubted. A first-class ticket being dismissed. A scene everyone thought they already understood. Jacob looked at them. Then he lowered his head for a brief moment, just a few seconds long enough for his silence to carve a deep cut in his own heart. He handed over the ticket. He stepped onto the jet bridge, and in that moment everyone believed he had lost. They had no idea that in 30 minutes their entire world would flip upside down. And it all started right here, in this exact second, from a quiet wound a gate agent assumed would fade into nothing. But it would not fade, and Skyark would never be the same again. No one on that plane realized they were witnessing a moment capable of toppling an entire rotten cultural system. All they saw was a black man in a suit walking down the aisle with a small suitcase, as if he were the last leftover passenger after every privilege had already been handed to those deemed more worthy. Samantha Reed blocked the aircraft door with a mechanical smile, but the instant her eyes dropped to the ticket in Jacob's hand, her expression hardened, turning cold like winter glass. "Sir, you cannot stand here," she said with the practiced tone of someone far too comfortable judging others. "Seat 1A is occupied. You need to move to the back." Every word she spoke felt like a public slap. Not loud, but sharp enough for a few first-class passengers behind her to glance over with thinly veiled amusement, waiting to see how this man would react. Jacob asked only one question. "Where is seat 32E?" His voice did not tremble, did not fear. It carried the quiet steadiness that makes people cautious. But Samantha showed no caution. She flicked her wrist toward the rear of the plane. "Near the restroom. Move quickly so we can let others board." Jacob walked. He felt every gaze clinging to his steps, as though he were crossing a bridge someone hoped would collapse under him, just to confirm their belief in their own privilege. The carpeted floor of first class was soft as mist. Behind him, the delicate clink of champagne glasses rang out where Edward Briggs reclined comfortably, sipping liquor, with narrowed, arrogant eyes, as he watched Jacob pass. In the business cabin, polite faces offered curt nods before turning back to their laptops, as if they had witnessed nothing unusual, just another black man being pushed to a lower section. But when Jacob stepped into economy, the world changed colors. Harsh neon lights, air thick with the smell of prepackaged meals, children crying, people sighing suitcases being shoved into overhead bins. Seat 32E sat between an elderly woman smelling of medicated balm and a teenager blasting game sounds far too loudly. Jacob bent down, placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him, and lowered himself into the cramped space where his knees touched the metal frame immediately. No one knew who he was. No one knew he controlled an airline worth billions. No one knew that the decisions he would make in the next few hours could alter the course of their own lives. And that was exactly why he chose silence. Silence to observe, silence to listen, silence to let every behavior reveal its true nature. Samantha walked past twice. She did not look at him, did not ask if he was all right. When serving drinks, she stopped at seat 30F, where a white man requested bourbon, and she handed him a sparkling glass. When Jacob gently asked for water, she did not turn. Her head merely dropped a warm plastic bottle onto his tray, as if it had been plucked from her pocket. The teenager beside Jacob smirked. "Looks like first class is full today, huh?" Laughter rippled across the row behind them. Jacob said nothing. He didn't need to. Something inside him was shifting, not anger, but the cold sharpness of a man mentally recording every detail as if collecting evidence. Then, soft as a candle flickering in a dark room, trainee flight attendant Alyssa Grant stopped beside him. Her eyes met his, steady and understanding. "I know what happened at the gate." "I'm sorry about that," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear of being overheard, yet still carrying courage. Jacob looked at her longer than usual, because kindness in the worst places always carried the greatest weight. "Thank you," he said. Alyssa handed him a cold bottle of water and a neatly folded napkin, then continued down the aisle. That small gesture was like the first crack in the sheet of ice covering the entire aircraft. The rest of the flight passed in silence. Jacob stared out the window, watching clouds drift by like floating memories of the years he once wished for a chance to sit in the seats at the front. He had achieved everything, yet this moment proved one truth. Even at the top, a single prejudiced glance could shove him back to the starting line. When the plane landed at JFK, passengers stood pulled luggage from overhead bins and exchanged cheerful wishes for good business trips or pleasant vacations. Samantha smiled sweetly at Edward Briggs and bowed her head when he praised her for handling the seating situation well. But Jacob remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his calmness so unsettling that Samantha stiffened. "So the plane has finished deplaning," she said, her patience thinning. Jacob looked up. "Not yet. I am waiting for my people." And when 3 men in black suits stepped into the cabin led by Anthony Briggs, the entire aircraft seemed to freeze. "Good afternoon, Mr. Warren," Anthony said, his deep voice carrying absolute respect. Samantha almost dropped her notebook. The air cracked open. Shocked eyes ricocheted across the cabin. Jacob rose slowly, steady, as if he had known this moment was coming all along. "Begin," he said to Anthony. "Start with Dallas." In that instant, the plane fell so silent that Samantha's heartbeat could be heard. She had no idea that 30 minutes in seat 32E had never been a humiliation. It had been an investigation, and now a new chapter of their lives was beginning, written by the voice of a man they had misjudged from the very first second. That night when Skyark Airlines posted its official statement on the website and across every social platform the company owned, the entire internet reacted as if someone had thrown a match into a dry field, and within minutes it erupted into a raging firestorm. Skyark Airlines has suspended multiple employees following a severe discrimination incident involving one of our own passengers. The statement was short, sharp, refusing to hide behind corporate language or evasive phrasing. It was the kind of message people had never seen from a major airline. And the next line: "The incident involved an unauthorized change to a first-class seat," was enough to send the public into an uproar. The post spread faster than the Texas summer heat comments pouring down like a waterfall. People still didn't know who the mistreated passenger was, but one clip was already everywhere, filmed by a traveler at Gate D14. Jacob being told to step aside, despite holding a ticket for seat 1A. That alone ignited nationwide fury. The next clip showing Samantha forcing Jacob to the back of the plane and dropping a warm bottle of water into his hand hit even harder. This is not a mistake. This is discrimination. I am done with this airline. The way he stayed silent that broke me. The hashtag 32E climbed straight to the top of trending topics. But what truly shocked people was the final line of Skyark's announcement: "We are conducting a high-level investigation." The person directly overseeing this inquiry is CEO Jacob Warren, The internet exploded. He was the victim. The CEO was humiliated on his own airline. I need the full video right now. But that was only the outside. Inside Skyark, it was chaos. Brian Keller submitted his resignation at 2:14 in the morning, but the HR auto-flag system intercepted it and sent it directly to Anthony Briggs. Anthony emailed Jacob. He wants to disappear from this. Jacob replied with a single line. No, he will face it. In the company's internal Slack departments were arguing like a courtroom with no judge. Frontline workers claimed Samantha always acted superior toward passengers who didn't fit the mold. Others said Megan profiled passengers based on appearance. An anonymous message shook the entire company. The culture on the Dallas to New York route treats first class like a private club. Anyone who doesn't look like money gets scrutinized. Jacob read that message 3 times. Each time cut deeper, because that was exactly why he had once stood in the same shoes as the very passenger he was now defending. That was why he had to verify everything himself, why he quietly placed himself in seat 32E to witness truths no report would ever dare to write. By the next morning, he ordered a mandatory company-wide town hall. Everyone must attend. On live stream, cameras on, microphones on if called. When the clock struck 2 in the afternoon, every employee, from pilots to baggage handlers, from marketing to IT, appeared in the virtual meeting room. Cameras were fully active. The air felt heavy as stone. Jacob stepped onto the small stage inside Skyark's Dallas headquarters, still wearing the same navy suit from the day before, the same steady eyes, except now, after the incident, he had become a symbol of accountability. I know you have all seen the videos, he began, his voice, slow, each word landing like a brick, rebuilding the company's moral foundation. And I know many of you believe I was on that flight by coincidence. He paused for several seconds, looking into every camera, every face. But no, I was there intentionally. A ripple of whispers swept through the virtual room. I received reports about the Dallas to New York route, Jacob continued, about the moments no one sees and no one records, about passengers treated poorly simply because they did not look like someone who deserved the seats at the front. He stepped forward. I wanted the truth. Raw truth. Not the clean version in reports. That is why I booked a ticket under an alias. Printed my own boarding pass. Told no one that I would be on that flight. A trainer covered her mouth. A senior flight attendant in New Jersey bowed her head. I am not angry, Jacob said quietly. I am disappointed, because I promised Skyark would never become like other airlines places where people are judged by appearance or skin color or clothing. But it happened. Right in front of me. Inside my own company. His voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of the grey sky outside the building. But we will fix it. And we will fix it by facing the truth head on. A technician began to cry. A veteran flight attendant looked down her shoulders, trembling. Not with a memo, not with a half-hearted apology, with action. Jacob looked directly into the camera, his gaze sharp as a newly honed blade. If you have stayed silent while watching injustice, stand up. If you have ever been mistreated, I will listen. And if you are the one who caused that injustice, you will face accountability. The meeting felt like a courtroom, but this was not a scene of punishment. It was a scene of rebirth. Skyark will change, Jacob concluded, and if someone does not want to change, the door is open for them to leave. But I will not allow this company to be a place where a black child or a single mother or any passenger feels like they do not belong. No one spoke. but thousands trembled, because they all knew one thing from the moment Jacob sat in seat 32E. Every old rule had died, and Skyark's tomorrow would never look like its yesterday again. The silence in the town hall dissolved like mist as thousands of employees closed their cameras and returned to work. But for Jacob Warren, the battle had only just begun. What the entire company had witnessed was merely the surface of an undercurrent that had been quietly festering for months. When the stage lights dimmed, Jacob walked into his office and placed a hand on the thick stack of files sitting on his desk. The complaints he had been tracking in secret, each page a small cut gleaming with painful truth. It had all started with 3 tiny emails, just a few lines each, the kind no one deemed important enough to escalate. I was asked to wait, even though my first-class ticket was valid. A flight attendant showed attitude when I entered the business cabin. The gate agent looked at me like I didn't belong. 3 at first, then 5, then 11, all tied to the Dallas to New York route, all sharing the same pattern, being questioned for not looking like a premium passenger. Every person who wrote a complaint was polite and composed, no yelling, no lawsuits, and that silence worried Jacob more than any angry outburst ever could. Because silence meant they were used to it. It meant this was no longer an incident. It was a culture. Jacob knew that feeling. He had lived it as a young man, with nothing staring at the seats up front like they were part of a world not meant for him. He had sworn that if he ever ran an airline, he would never let anyone feel that way again. And yet here he was, watching his own employees chip away at that promise, day after day, flight after flight. The reports coming from middle management were all softened. The word discrimination was replaced with misunderstanding. Hostile behavior became firm communication. Jacob stared at those phrases, feeling his chest tighten. He had led enough companies to know what it meant when reports were polished. It meant the culture was protecting its faults, and he would not allow that. One late night, with only his office light still on, Jacob made a decision. He would verify everything himself. No assistant, no IT, no security team. He created an alias in the system, booked a ticket under the name Daniel Ford, and the IT department printed the boarding pass, unaware that it belonged to their CEO. Jacob personally executed the override that moved seat 1A out of reach, ensuring no one would question anything. He chose a suit that was professional but unremarkable, grabbed the plainest briefcase he owned, and went to the airport standing in line like any regular traveler. No assistant, no escorts, no one recognized him, and that was exactly what he wanted. But what hurt Jacob the most was not that they didn't recognize him. It was that they judged him the moment they saw him. When Megan doubted him, when Brian pushed him aside, when strangers glanced at him with dismissive curiosity, Jacob understood that every complaint he had read was true. He saw the culture of his company through the eyes of the people most affected by it, something no report could ever capture. And that flight, from the moment he was reassigned to seat 32E to the moment he was treated like someone out of place on the very aircraft carrying the logo he built, was a brutal truth he could not ignore. But what shocked him the most was not Megan's actions or Samantha's coldness, but the silence of the passengers around him, people who saw something wrong and chose their own comfort over justice. They never knew that the man quietly being pushed aside had the power to change their lives. But Jacob didn't need them to know. He only needed the truth. After the town hall, Jacob walked into a closed door, meeting with the board of directors. 12 people in immaculate suits stared at him, half fearful, half disapproving of him putting himself in danger. But he did not let them speak. "I know what you're thinking." Jacob began, his voice soft but sharp, like a blade fresh from the grindstone. "Why didn't I let compliance handle it? Why didn't I rely on the reporting system?" He paused, letting their restless eyes flicker in the dim light. "Because I do not trust that the system will give me the truth." A director parted his lips to argue, but Jacob lifted a hand. "Not because they are incompetent, but because they are too accustomed to protecting procedures instead of protecting people." He leaned forward slightly, and I chose to break that cycle. Silence fell again, heavy as a velvet curtain. Then Margaret Lane, the 58-year-old head of HR, looked at him for a long moment and asked, "You accepted the risk of being publicly humiliated?" Jacob gave a faint smile, one weighted with more sadness than the grey sky outside the window. "If I as a CIO can be treated like that, imagine how an ordinary passenger is treated." Margaret didn't respond. No one did. Because they all knew he was right. Jacob rose and walked toward the window overlooking the runway. A Skyark aircraft was rolling forward, sunlight glinting off its fuselage like a painful reminder. "It's time for us to look at ourselves," he said, "and start again." And in that moment, they all understood. Flight 32. E wasn't merely a mistake. It was the clearest diagnosis of Skyark's cultural disease, and Jacob was the only one willing to walk straight into the storm, to drag the truth back into the light. After the meeting with the board of directors, when the heavy doors finally closed, Jacob Warren stepped into the long hallway of Skyark headquarters, with a heart weighed down like stone. But he knew one thing clearly: this was not the time to rest. This was the time to walk straight into the place where every problem had begun, inside the very people who made up the company. He no longer wanted to hear polished reports, no longer wanted explanations, softened to sound professional and safe. He wanted the truth, raw and unfiltered. And over the next several weeks, he went from floor to floor, department to department branch, to branch unannounced, without assistance, without an entourage, simply to see and to listen. Employees were stunned to find the CEO of a billion-dollar airline sitting on plastic chairs in their break rooms, drinking instant coffee and listening closely to even the smallest comments about how they felt inside Skyark's culture. And within the first few days, the deepest wounds began to surface. A black aerospace engineer, tears streaming down his face, told him he had once been asked by an airport worker, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" even while wearing a full Skyark technical uniform. An Asian maintenance employee shared that passengers ignored her when she tried to assist them, yet the moment a white colleague approached, everything suddenly became easy. A Latina flight attendant explained that she had been marked as difficult in 3 consecutive performance reviews simply because she enforced safety rules strictly, while lighter-skinned co-workers doing the exact same thing were praised as assertive and professional. Jacob listened. He did not argue. He did not offer premature solutions. He simply listened, because sometimes the most healing thing is not a promise of change, but finally having someone who truly hears you. Then he moved through the corporate offices. In the HR department, a young employee revealed that a regional manager had once told her outright, "People who look like you don't usually get promoted to high positions. Trying too hard won't make a difference." The story made Jacob clench his hands until his knuckles turned white. He thought about the complaints he had read, the whispers, the avoided eye contact. None of this was random. It was a system, and systems must be dismantled. He immediately ordered a complete overhaul of the internal complaint process, full anonymity, independent reviewers, and every report to be sent directly to the CEO's office with no middle layer able to soften anything. But resistance soon appeared. Some employees were uncomfortable watching their old culture being challenged. A group of senior pilots sent a long email accusing Skyark of falling into woke ideology and undermining the core spirit of aviation. The email leaked instantly, sparking fierce debates inside the company. Jacob read the message at 2 a.m, his eyes exhausted, but unwavering. The next morning, he called the pilot to his office, not to fire him, but to confront reality. The conversation lasted more than an hour, during which the pilot had to listen to colleagues, to passengers who had experienced discrimination, and to young employees whom he had unintentionally hurt with dismissive remarks. Jacob stood silently in the back of the room, observing. He didn't need to scold or dominate. The truth spoke for him. And as the pilot's eyes lowered and his shoulders sagged, Jacob knew culture cannot be changed by authority, but by forcing people to face the truth placed right in front of them. As for the people directly involved in Jacob's flight, the tension was even heavier. Megan Holt hired a lawyer, immediately insisting she was being made a scapegoat. Samantha Reed disappeared from social media, erasing every trace of Skyark from her profiles. Brian Keller pretended to stay calm, but the fear creeping into his eyes every time an email arrived from the executive office betrayed him. Jacob didn't rush to punish them. He wanted the process to be transparent, fair, and thorough. "We don't punish for spectacle," he told the legal team. "We punish to correct." In the midst of all this, the only person lifted upward was Alyssa Grant, the young flight attendant who had chosen the right side when no one else dared. Jacob placed her on the cultural advisory panel, giving her the chance to help rewrite the training programs so that small acts of courage like hers would become the new standard of Skyark. During sessions with the training rewrite team, Alyssa described the subtle things passengers never saw, how some flight attendants whispered insults about travelers, how people mentally categorized passengers by appearance, how Megan's sharp, slicing glances could make someone shrink into themselves. Every word she spoke was a mirror reflecting the truths Jacob needed. From that, new training modules were created identifying unconscious bias, handling incidents of discrimination, serving first-class passengers without favoring skin tone or appearance. Jacob approved every line, every instructional clip, every simulated scenario. This was not training. This was cultural surgery. But culture does not change in a day. It requires confrontation, pain, the tearing away of old illusions before the healing can begin. And Jacob accepted all of that. He knew the journey would be long, difficult, and would make many people resent him. But walking through the hallway, as young employees looked at him with gratitude in their eyes, he knew he was moving in the right direction. Because every real transformation begins at its most brutal moment. And Skyark's brutal moment had happened in seat 32E. Now it was time to rebuild everything, starting from that number. When the legal department and HR finished drafting the disciplinary recommendations for every individual involved in the Dallas to New York incident, the stack of documents was so thick it resembled a tragic novel about truths the aviation industry always tries to hide. They placed the files in front of Jacob Warren and told him everything was ready. Termination options, license, suspensions, reimbursement requirements. even varying levels of formal warnings based on the severity of each violation. But as Jacob flipped through the pages, he saw only one thing: procedure. Cold procedure. Procedure stripped of humanity. Procedure that turned every wrongdoing into a lifeless line on paper. He hated it. This is not justice. Jacob said, his voice so deep the room fell silent. This is just checking a box. Anthony Briggs stood nearby, waiting. A senior attorney gently explained that this was industry standard. But Jacob had no use for standards. "I want to speak with them," he said. "Each one." The room went still, as if he had demanded the impossible. "You want one-on-one meetings with everyone?" Anthony asked. "Everyone," Jacob repeated. "No HR, no lawyers. I want to look them in the eye when they explain what they did. And I want them to look me in the eye when they hear the consequences." The entire company had to reorganize schedules for a series of private meetings lasting several days. The first person to walk in was Megan Holt. She sat across from Jacob in a defensive pose, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the table, trying to maintain the hardened posture her lawyer must have rehearsed with her. "I followed procedure," she said immediately, as if afraid he might speak first. "I checked the ticket. I did what any gate agent would do." Jacob said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply remained silent, and that silence made Megan far more uneasy than any sharp question could. "I didn't know who you were," she added, her voice rising slightly, as if trying to reclaim some authority. A long pause followed. Then Jacob leaned forward. "If I were not the CEO," he asked softly, "what would have happened to me that day?" Megan opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A single needle-thin question piercing straight through the deepest part of the truth. Because she knew the answer. She knew it perfectly well. And that was why she said nothing more. Next was Samantha Reed. Unlike Megan, Samantha entered with red, swollen eyes, hands trembling as she held a folded handwritten letter. "I'm not that kind of person," she said the moment the door closed. I don't know why I acted so terribly. I thought I was just doing my job, but her voice cracked. I forgot I was dealing with a human being. Jacob let her speak, let her release everything she had been holding inside during the days when the entire nation condemned her. And when she finally went quiet, he said only one sentence, a sentence that broke her completely. "Being taught to be kind does not mean you will choose kindness when no one is watching." Samantha's head dropped, and for the first time since the incident, she stopped trying to protect her image. The hardest meeting was with Brian Keller. He walked in with forced confidence, his suit perfectly buttoned, an expensive watch on his wrist, as if clinging to the remnants of old authority. "We all know the check-in system had an error," Brian said coolly. "I prioritized based on status. Any supervisor would have done the same." Jacob slid a system log across the table. "You manually overrode seat 1A, he said quietly. Brian glanced at the page, then quickly looked back up, trying to appear unfazed. "I picked the passenger with higher priority," he said. "There was nothing else involved." "Priority you assigned," Jacob replied, his tone soft, but slicing through Brian's defenses like a scalpel. "What did you base that choice on?" A dead silence filled the room. Brian swallowed hard. For the first time, he lost his composure. "You don't need to say it aloud," Jacob continued gently. "You just need to know it yourself." And in that moment, the collapse inside Brian was plain in his eyes, the eyes of a man who had been so certain he was justified. The meetings continued with others as well, a ground crew worker, a secondary ticket scanner, a member of the route oversight team. Each person was a story, another layer of habit, fear, unconscious bias, and silence that had helped shape the cruel moment at Gate D14. But what exhausted Jacob most was not the wrongdoing itself, it was the excuses. Everyone does it, I didn't mean to. This is just how that route works. He no longer wanted to hear about culture. Culture is not an independent creature living outside human responsibility. Culture is built by choices, individual choices, repeated day after day after day, and those choices had hardened into habit. After the final meeting, Jacob remained alone in his dimly lit office. The warm yellow light fell over the stacks of pages filled with stories no one ever wanted to read. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled so deeply it was as if he released an entire world of weight from his chest. But then he opened his eyes. Looking at the files, he knew it wasn't over. The truth had surfaced, but dealing with it was only the beginning. His goal wasn't to fire people. It wasn't to make headlines. It was to make justice visible, audible, and human. And starting tomorrow, he would face the harder task, deciding whether to give them a chance to change or to let them walk out of Skyark forever. That choice would shape not just their lives, but the entire soul of the airline he built from nothing. 3 days after the series of blunt conversations with everyone involved, Jacob Warren entered the heaviest phase of the reform, no longer exposing wrongdoing, but touching the deepest layer where culture had taken root like an invisible web. The Skyark headquarters, usually lively, had grown quiet, as if the entire company was holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. But Jacob knew the verdict was not about who stayed or who left. It was about changing how people thought, felt, and behaved when no one was watching. So instead of hiding in the executive office, he continued walking through every department like a familiar silhouette. In the HR office of the Houston branch, he sat listening to a young employee admit she had never dared report discriminatory behavior because everyone said it was just a small thing. In the Phoenix branch, he spoke with a Mexican baggage handler who had been treated as if he didn't exist by both passengers and colleagues. "They think I don't understand English," he said, so hurt that his hand clenched his bag strap tight. "They say I'm just manual labor." Jacob felt his chest twist. He knew people like this had no stage to speak, no camera to record them, no one to stand on their side until now. Then he visited Tech Ops, where a black engineer shared that he had once been stopped at a checkpoint because he didn't look like an engineer. He laughed as he told the story, but Jacob could hear the wound beneath that laugh. "I wrote the automation software for that plane," the engineer said. "Yet they asked me if I was lost." Jacob didn't respond. He simply placed a hand on the man's shoulder, and his eyes conveyed all the apologies the aviation industry had owed this man for years. But a company cannot change on pain alone. It requires action. So Jacob ordered the training system to be rebuilt from zero. Not patched, not adjusted. Rebuilt. He convened the cultural task force and placed Alyssa Grant, the young trainee who had dared to do what was right, into the core team. When she walked into the training room, wearing a badge that was still new, many people didn't understand why the CEO had brought a junior flight attendant into the largest training overhaul in company history. But Jacob understood her value kindness in the worst circumstances. That was the new standard he wanted, embedded into the system. In the first meeting, Alyssa described the moment she saw Samantha hand Jacob the warm bottle of water. "I wanted to speak up," she confessed. "But I was afraid of being scolded, afraid of being seen as interfering with someone else's job. Jacob looked at her for a long moment and said, "And yet you still chose the right side. A single small act from you was enough to save the entire system." The room fell silent. No one added anything, but everyone understood. Sometimes one small act can overturn an entire culture. From her stories and many others, the new training framework began to take shape. Real situation simulations, role-play sessions, allowing employees to experience how it feels to be misjudged, unconscious bias modules based not on theory, but on real incidents within the company. No more avoiding hard conversations. No more sugar-coated language, only truth and the courage to face it. But cultural change always brings resistance. Some veteran supervisors made their displeasure clear. They insisted Jacob was overreacting, that the incident happened only because he was the CEO, that one event couldn't represent the entire company. An anonymous message appeared on the internal system. "Skyark is losing its identity. We are turning everyone into victims." Jacob read it. He didn't grow angry. He didn't defend himself. He simply sighed, because he knew this was the real battlefield, not Megan, not Samantha, but the ingrained mindsets, the stories people told themselves to protect their biases. So he confronted it by creating mandatory listening sessions rooms, where everyone had to sit together, listen without interrupting, and could not defend themselves until the other person finished speaking. In one session, a Pakistani mother described being told to remove her headscarf at the gate, even though it was not a TSA requirement. A gay male flight attendant shared how passengers often dismissed him simply because his voice was soft. An Indian technician manager revealed that passengers frequently asked if he was their Uber driver, even though he oversaw entire technical crews. Those who had objected to the new training sat and listened stiff, at first rigid with resistance, but as the stories continued, their faces slowly softened. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of realization. Realization that the problem was not somewhere else. It was them. After that session, many people left with different eyes. Some with tears. Some looking at Alyssa with genuine respect. Some approaching Jacob quietly to say, "I never realized I made others feel that way." Jacob didn't say much. He simply nodded because that was the first step, and it was the most important step of all. Culture does not change through slogans or posters. It changes when a heart changes. And the first heart had already shifted. Thousands more would need to follow. But Jacob wasn't afraid. Because he had sat in set 32E, had been humiliated on the very airline he built, and still stood up to ignite the largest cultural transformation in Skyark's history. And from that moment, he knew if one person dares to stand, the entire system will be forced to move slowly, painfully, but never backward again. As the listening sessions stretched into the second week, and the wave of change began threading its way through every layer of the workforce, Jacob Warren stepped into the most critical conversation of all the discussion he knew would determine how Skyark would face the public, the investors, and the company's own collective conscience, the closed-door meeting with the entire board of directors. They were already waiting for him in the glass-walled room on the 48th floor overlooking the runway, where Skyark aircraft were taxiing below each engine, humming like it too was waiting for the answer, carried by the man about to walk in. Jacob didn't sit. He stood beside the glass, watching silver specks move across the sky. Only after a long, contemplative silence did he finally speak, his voice soft yet unwavering. "I know you have many questions," he said, "and today I will answer all of them. Margaret Lane. Chairwoman of the board, a woman with more than 3 decades embedded in the aviation world, spoke first. "Jacob, why didn't you use the internal channels? You put yourself in a dangerous position. You placed yourself at the center of a crisis. That is not how a CEO operates." Several heads nodded. Others stayed expressionless, but their clenched hands told a different story. Jacob turned from the window, his gaze calm in a way that unsettled even the most seasoned executives. "I didn't warn anyone," he said, "because I didn't believe they would give me the truth." A senior board member frowned. "They are your employees, your system." "No," Jacob replied, "they are the product of a culture that has turned truth into the last thing anyone brings to the table." He stepped toward the large desk, placing his pen down with the finality of a verdict. "When truth is distorted, I must go and find it myself." Someone from the legal division leaned forward. "But if your identity had been discovered mid-flight, what if passengers filmed you and leaked it?" Jacob gave a faint, tired smile. "Then the world would see what our passengers experience every single day." The room froze. Not because his answer was wrong, but because it was painfully, undeniably right. "I am not afraid of being seen in economy," Jacob continued. "What I fear is that if I don't experience it myself, I will allow a broken system to keep operating under my name." Frank Dawson, a long-standing conservative member of the board, folded his hands, eyes filled with doubt. "So you used the entire system to test your staff. You pushed the airline into a media storm." Jacob met his stare. "I didn't push them into a storm. They were already in one. I simply turned on the light." Silence crashed over the room like a soundless storm. Jacob knew this was the moment to say the thing he had never shared. He stood straighter, both hands resting on the edge of the table. "When I was 14, he began, I flew to New York with my mother. We were in the last rows, the seat closest to the restroom." His voice tightened as memories rose like ghosts. "I watched first-class passengers be greeted as Sir and Madam, while we were treated like dust on the floor." He paused, the recollection pressing against his throat. "I promised myself that when I grew up, I would build a place where no one would be treated the way my mother and I were." He looked around the room, pain and resolve woven into one. "And yet I witnessed that exact thing happen under my own logo. No one dared interrupt." At gate D14 that day, Jacob said quietly, "I wasn't just stripped of a seat. I was stripped of the promise I spent my entire life protecting." Another board member finally spoke, voice softer now. "What do you want from us, Jacob?" He inhaled deeply. "I want change, not on paper. Not in a memo. Change in how we see people." Then his tone sharpened, firm as a judge's gavel. "We cannot fix only the procedures. We must fix the soul of Skyark." Someone asked, "And where does that begin?" Jacob answered instantly, by refusing to hide from responsibility. He didn't pull out reports. He didn't point to metrics. Instead, he told them about the tears he'd seen in the listening sessions, the hidden stories employees had finally voiced, the fear in the engineer who had been asked if he was lost, the trembling in young workers who admitted they had stayed silent for too long. "I don't want to build an aviation empire," Jacob said. "I want to build a place where every person feels seen." Then slowly, he stretched out his hand toward the runway outside, where a Skyark jet was preparing for takeoff. An airline doesn't just carry people. It carries their stories. And if their stories are distorted by bias, then we have failed. No one spoke for several minutes. Only the sound of aircraft engines rose through the glass, as if the sky itself was listening. Finally, Margaret Lane stood and moved to Jacob's side. Her voice was raspy but firm. "You have my support, Jacob. And the board's." Another member nodded, then another. Then the entire table. Not because they were unafraid of the crisis, but because they finally understood what a real CEO must protect. Not image, not profit, but dignity. And when a man was willing to stake his entire reputation on a single trip to seat 32E, they understood this was not an investigation. This was a declaration. From that moment on, the board no longer looked at Jacob as an ordinary CEO. They saw him as the only person brave enough to pull Skyark out of the darkness it had created for itself. And from that day forward, the weight of the reform no longer belonged to him. Alone, it belonged to an entire system, awakening not because it was forced, but because it finally understood why it must change. As the listening sessions carried into the second week and the wave of change began seeping through every layer of the company, Jacob Warren stepped into the most defining conversation of all, the one he knew would shape how Skyark faced the public, the investors, and its own collective conscience, the closed meeting with the full board of directors. When the board aligned with Jacob to move forward with a full cultural overhaul, Skyark felt like a giant creature waking up after a violent electric shock. The atmosphere inside the company shifted in an uncanny way. The forced smiles were gone. The empty reassurances, "everything is fine," no longer echoed through the hallways. In their place were cautious eyes mixed with hope, as if everyone was silently waiting to see whether this was just another temporary PR storm or the beginning of a new era. Jacob understood the responsibility on his shoulders was heavier than any confrontation he had faced before. Fixing processes was simple. Fixing people's hearts was the real battle, and that was why he didn't sit in his office signing off changes. He chose to walk, from the Dallas headquarters to the Atlanta branch to Denver, Seattle, and Newark. Everywhere he went, he didn't speak as the CEO. He spoke as a man who had once been mistreated on a plane that carried his own company's logo. In Denver, an LGBT employee stood during a listening session and confessed, voice shaking, that passengers often mistook him for a cabin decorator rather than a flight attendant. In Chicago, a Vietnamese-American worker shared that she was constantly told her English was hard to understand, even though she was born in California. In each session, Jacob listened with a quiet weight, not a silence that made people shrink, but a silence that made them feel seen, perhaps for the first time. Confessions spilled out. Tears dropped onto office floors. Long-buried truths finally surfaced. They fell like the first rain of the season, softening soil that had become hardened by years of silence. But what surprised Jacob most was not the pain of those who had been marginalized. It was the awakening of those who had caused that pain. A group of long-time supervisors came to him, not through email, not through managers, but by knocking on the door of the conference room where he was working. They entered without meeting his eyes, shoulders sagging like men carrying guilt. "We never realized it was this bad," one of them said. "We were following habit, following what the people before us taught. We never meant harm." Jacob didn't rise. He simply looked at them, eyes neither condemning nor forgiving. "Never meant harm," he repeated quietly, "is the most dangerous trap of all." The room went silent. Jacob continued, voice both gentle and razor-sharp. "I don't need perfection. I need awareness." The sentence hit them like a light striking the darkest part of the room. Those supervisors began volunteering for the new training programs, choosing to lead the correction of the very mistakes they once helped perpetuate. 2 weeks later, in a role-play workshop, those same supervisors acted as passengers facing discrimination. One man burst into tears when asked to show his documents again, admitting he had never understood the humiliation until that moment. And Jacob knew the culture was finally beginning to change. But while some hearts were healing, Skyark still lived under the shadow of a truth it could not avoid: the individuals tied directly to the 32E incident were still suspended between consequence and redemption. While Megan and her lawyer continued sending emails demanding compensation for her damaged reputation, while Samantha attended counseling sessions provided by the company, while Brian Keller maintained a cold facade that barely concealed his growing fear, every department in the company trembled under the same question, the question Jacob knew would come eventually. How do we handle this fairly? He didn't avoid it. In a leadership meeting, Jacob spoke clearly. We don't punish to vent anger. We punish to send a message. An operations director asked what message Jacob met his eyes: that the dignity of our passengers is not negotiable. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They examined every case, every nuance in behavior, every detail of context. Jacob allowed no extremism, but also no excuses. He wanted fairness, and fairness depended not only on mistakes, but on choices. And at the end of the meeting, when everyone was exhausted from analyzing and debating, Jacob pushed the stack of files aside and said, "I want to speak to each of them once more before making the final decision." The leadership team did not understand why he wanted one more confrontation. But Jacob understood perfectly. Because this reform was not about tearing people down. It was about bringing Skyark back to the promise he had made on the very first day of founding the airline. We do not merely fly. We lift people. And during those final one-on-one conversations, something unexpected happened. A ground crew member, someone who had played only a minor role in the incident, walked in with teary eyes and said, "I stood there that day. I saw how they treated you, but I didn't do anything. I was scared of losing my job." Jacob simply nodded without judgment. "Thank you for telling the truth." The man cried instantly, and Jacob realized that silence was the very first enemy he needed to break. After that conversation, the voices of those who had once stayed silent began rising inside the company. They shared stories of witnessing discrimination, stories of wanting to speak but being afraid, stories of choosing silence because they believed nothing could change. Jacob listened to every word. He did not judge, because he knew cultural change does not begin with the people who do wrong. It begins with the people brave enough to speak the truth. And once the truth is spoken, it cannot be placed back into a drawer. It spreads. It seeps into every layer of Skyark, forcing everyone to confront themselves. In the red dusk over Dallas, Jacob stood watching Skyark planes lift into the sky. He knew he still had one enormous decision left, a decision that would shape the final chapter of this entire reform. But he also knew something far more important. No matter how those who made mistakes would be held accountable. Skyark had already begun to change through the hearts courageous enough to look inward. And to him, that was the first true victory since the moment he had been pushed down to seat 32E. 3 months after everything exploded at Gate D, 14, Skyark Airlines still looked the same from the outside. The logo was still silver blue, the uniforms still crisp, The aircraft still taxied smoothly along the Dallas runway, as if the company had never weathered the greatest public crisis in its history. But to the people inside, Skylark had changed its color entirely. The cracks that once hid beneath the surface had been pulled into the light dissected Heald. And at the center of that transformation was the final decision Jacob Warren would make today, a decision that would define Skylark for years, perhaps an entire decade. In his large glass office overlooking the airport, Jacob sat before 3 remaining folders. Each one represented a person, a choice, a chain of actions that had led to the brutal moment at Gate D14. Megan Holt, Samantha Reed, Brian Keller. He had met them, listened to them, seen in their eyes fear, regret, defensiveness, and wounds they didn't even know they carried. But Jacob's decision could not be based on their emotions. It had to be based on what Skylark wanted to become. He opened Megan's file first. Her ID photo stared back with the same coldness she'd shown when she denied his right to sit in seat 1A. That look didn't reveal malice, but it revealed something just as dangerous a conviction, that her instincts were always right, that her position granted her the authority to judge a passenger's worth in seconds. As he reread her statements, the silence in the room thickened. Megan had never truly apologized. She hadn't owned her mistake, only repeated, "I followed procedure." But the new Skylark no longer accepted a worldview filtered through emotionless procedure. And so Jacob's decision regarding Megan was clear termination. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because she refused to look inward, refused to open the door to change, a door the new Skylark required everyone to walk through. Samantha's file made him pause much longer. He remembered her tearful eyes, the trembling voice, as she admitted, "I forgot he was a human being." That remorse was not an act. It came from a deep place inside her, a woman who believed she was kind, but had been swept into a culture of serve based on appearance. Samantha had not meant harm, but she had chosen wrong at the moment when no one was watching. And choices carry consequences. Jacob wrote into her file, 8-month suspension, mandatory participation in the new full training program and reinstatement only after passing a behavioral evaluation. He did not save her, but he gave her the opportunity to save herself. Then came Brian Keller's file, the heaviest of all. Because among the 3, Brian had shaped the very passenger ranking culture that defined the problem. He had shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, and worse, he believed the authority he held allowed him to rearrange seats according to his personal criteria. Jacob reopened the override log. It sat there plainly, an unspoken confession in digital ink. Power placed in the hands of someone who lacks respect for people becomes a weapon. And so Brian's file closed with 2 words, termination, recommended. When Jacob signed all 3 decisions, he leaned back in his chair. There was no triumph, no relief, only a deep, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes when true justice does not bring joy, but creates space for the right things to take root. And the right things began growing immediately. That very afternoon, in the new training room, Alyssa Grant stood before a group of young flight attendants with a confidence she did not possess 3 months earlier. She held up a slide with bold words, "Every passenger is a story." The sentence hit Jacob, who watched unseen through the glass, like a soft blow to the chest. Alyssa looked straight at her trainees. "I saw with my own eyes what happens when we forget," that she said. "And I will not let it happen again." Never mind that she was young, inexperienced, or slightly trembling as she spoke. What she had, what Jacob saw clearly, was a heart placed in the right position. That was the new generation of Skyark leadership. 2 weeks later, during a business trip to New York, Jacob witnessed something he would never forget. A middle-aged black man, a university professor named Julian Michaels, approached Gate D14 with a first-class ticket in hand. The gate agent smiled. No suspicion, no scrutiny, no instruction to wait. "Welcome aboard, sir. You're in seat 2A, wishing you a comfortable flight." It wasn't a forced smile. It wasn't performance. It was one human treating another like a human. Jacob stood at a distance, unseen, but he felt a piece of his heart return to him. That day, as a Skyark plane lifted into the New York sky, Jacob sat in a small conference room at JFK Airport. On the wall hung the design of Skyark's newest aircraft, emblazoned with the words he had personally ordered to be engraved on its metal body. "Every seat holds a story. Seat 1A, Seat 32E, Seat 2A of Professor Julian." The seat of the engineer who had been doubted. The seat of the woman judged for her accent. Every story had built the new Skyark an airline still imperfect, but finally understanding what it must become. When his assistant walked in with the daily report, it included an email from a regional office. "The first month of cultural auditing is complete. Employees feel more respected. We are becoming what we promised." Jacob closed his eyes for a few seconds, letting those words sink deep into him. No applause, no fireworks. No one knew the journey he had taken from seat 1A to seat 32E and back into the sky. But he knew, and that was enough. Because sometimes changing the world does not begin with a roar. It begins when one person chooses to sit in the seat the world told him he did not belong in, and rises again carrying the truth. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and power dynamics, the journey of Jacob Warren reveals a truth that seems simple, yet is incredibly difficult to practice. A company is only truly strong when it dares to confront its own shadows. The incident in seat 32E was not just a moment of misconduct. It was a mirror reflecting unconscious biases, outdated habits, and the fractures every organization carries, but few are brave enough to face. Jacob proved that real change does not come from harsh punishment, but from the courage to step into the truth, to listen to understand, and to rebuild an entire system from within. If this story resonates with you, please like to help spread the message and subscribe to follow more journeys where justice is not only spoken, but lived. Before you go, comment these 3 words: trust in people.